This is President John F. Kennedy. Kennedy is one of our most well-known presidents, partly because of his assassination in 1963, which is the most recent assassination of any U.S. president, and after Kennedy's death, he was replaced by his vice president, Lyndon Johnson, who was instrumental in passing the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, and various other social programs that were meant to fix poverty, homelessness, hunger, support education and increase federal funding for education, as well as making further progress on the issue of civil rights. What if Kennedy had survived, though? How would our country be different today, and what would Kennedy's legacy as president be, if not for his assassination? Now, it's important to note that Kennedy was suffering from health issues long before he was assassinated, and it's very likely that in his second term, he would have died from Addison's disease, which was this very serious disease he had that most likely would have killed him somewhere near his second term. So really the scenario is, what if JFK never died, not what if he had never been assassinated. And another way to think of this is, what if Lyndon B. Johnson was never president, if that's the way you want to think of it. So with that out of the way, let's get started. So Kennedy was, so many of Lyndon B. Johnson's policy proposals regarding homelessness, poverty, hunger, education, civil rights, had all come from President Kennedy's great New Frontier, except it was amplified into Lyndon Johnson's Great Society. And Kennedy was having difficulty getting his New Frontier programs passed, largely due to conservative opposition, led by Howard Smith, the representative from Virginia, who had chaired the House Rules Committee. Now, Kennedy's Civil Rights Act was stuck in Smith's committee, and this was particularly an issue because Kennedy was not able to get the bill out of committee, and Kennedy would most likely be forced to compromise. In fact, Kennedy was never really a big supporter of civil rights. Throughout the 1950s, or even before that, he had never really done as much about the issue of civil rights. In fact, Nixon had a better civil rights record than Kennedy ever had throughout in the Senate and throughout Nixon's vice presidency. Kennedy had courted Southern whites and their opposition to civil rights, particularly in the 1956 Democratic Convention, where he wanted to be selected as Adlai Stevenson's vice president, and he, in fact, voted against the initial version of Dwight Eisenhower's Civil Rights Act of 1957, but after the bill was weakened significantly, Kennedy then voted for it. It's important, so Kennedy would most likely be forced to compromise over this issue, and he wouldn't really have much of a problem doing so. He most likely would cut public accommodations, as well as federal workforce and the judicial system from the bill. So the Civil Rights Bill had forced equal public accommodations, as well as equal federal hiring, as well as the fact that it made it much easier for civil rights cases to go into the federal courts than state courts. So ultimately, Kennedy would have to cut these sections out of the bill, as these were the most controversial and unpopular sections of the bill at the time, particularly among conservatives. And voting rights, Kennedy would also have to cut, just like Lyndon B. Johnson did. But unlike Johnson, Kennedy would significantly weaken the bill to the point where civil rights activists would be furious with him. Kennedy would still face a challenge from George Wallace. In fact, George Wallace had previously announced a challenge to Kennedy before Kennedy was even assassinated. Kennedy would defeat Wallace, however, and in the general election, his opponent would be Barry Goldwater. Barry Goldwater would have attacked Kennedy's relations with Khrushchev, deeming them as too friendly, as well as Kennedy's handling of the Vietnam War, which would still be an issue. Something which generally isn't brought up that much is that Kennedy was actually the president who had started deploying the troops to Vietnam, not Johnson. Johnson, however, had amplified the conflict to much more than Kennedy had ever dreamed of making it, and Kennedy would most likely have withdrawn from Vietnam much earlier than we actually did in our own timeline. However, the Vietnam War would have still been going around at this point of time, and Goldwater would have attacked Kennedy for not being aggressive enough. Kennedy and Goldwater were friends, however, and there was even a proposed debates between them in which Kennedy and Goldwater would both fly in the Air Force One, and they would just debate in different regions of the country. And Ultimately, though, Kennedy would easily defeat Goldwater, given how extreme Goldwater's views were to some Americans. And ultimately, though, Goldwater would do much better than he did in our own timeline, given the fact that Kennedy would not have run as dirty of a campaign against him as Johnson did. There wouldn't have been as much fear-mongering towards Goldwater, as well as the fact that Goldwater would have been much more the pain and the anguish over Kennedy's death would not have been a factor also. So Goldwater would do better, however, he would still lose in a landslide. The Democratic Party would be different, and most likely the Democrats' proposal to strengthen Social Security through Medicare and Medicaid would have been much weaker, as well as the fact that the federal government as a whole would be much smaller throughout this time, largely because Lyndon B. Johnson's Great Society had widely, and I mean like literally, it had significantly expanded the size of the federal government. The Vietnam War would still be a major controversy today, and rather than the Vietnam War being universally regarded as a failure, today the Vietnam War would actually be more split. Some would argue that the United States needed to be more aggressive in Vietnam, while others would favor Kennedy's plan to withdraw from Vietnam. Also, given the fact that Kennedy would have withdrawn from Vietnam earlier than we did in our own timeline, it's likely that the hippie movement and counterculture would still have happened, but not nearly to the extent given the fact that much of it had originated from folks who did not want to get drafted in the Vietnam War. Kennedy's presidency today would widely be regarded as above average, given the fact that mainly because of his handling of the Cuban Missile Crisis, but his decision to pull out of Vietnam would be very controversial today and would still be debated among historians and scholars, as well as his weakening of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Civil rights today probably would still happen, although much, much later, and maybe we would still have some remnants of discrimination today. You could argue that we still do, but it would have been much stronger anyway, and I could also say that Kennedy would most likely be succeeded by Lyndon Johnson or Richard Nixon as president, and most likely it would be Nixon because Kennedy and Johnson did not have the best relationship, and I doubt that Kennedy would give really a strong endorsement to Lyndon Johnson, as well as the fact that George Wallace would also have hurt Lyndon Johnson through his third-party bid, which would take away Southern Democrats from Johnson, as well as the fact that Nixon would hammer Kennedy for his handling of the Vietnam War, which at the time would have been unpopular given the fact that many Americans had sought Cold War aggression. And Nixon would most likely be elected the next president, and you would have seen a map like this. Wallace would have done slightly better in the South than he did in our own timeline because Republican inroads in the South were really made through fury over the Civil Rights Act of 1964, but with the Civil Rights Act being much significantly weaker, I would say that Nixon would not do that well in the South as he did in our own timeline. Ultimately, though, we would probably have a much more interventionist foreign policy today, largely because of the fact that because of how much of a failure the Vietnam War was, the government is now very hesitant to fully commit to a war in the Middle East or somewhere because of the Vietnam War. So we probably would have a much more interventionist foreign policy, as well as a much more limited government, because the Great Society, Lyndon Johnson's Great Society, really was what inflamed the size of the federal government. So Kennedy would not be nearly as praised by historians as he was in our own timeline, given his gutting of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, as well as his controversial decision to exit Vietnam. However, he would still probably be seen as an above-average president, or maybe even like average, because of his handling of the Cuban Missile Crisis and events like that. So ultimately, I would say Kennedy's assassination was really what made him this great president or martyr that many historians and common people like to think of him as. So thank you guys for watching this video. Make sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel, and bye.